Mactan Island lies just off the coast of Cebu, a low strip of coral and mangrove in the central Philippines. The date is the 27th of April in the year 1521. Before dawn, 3 small boats push off from a Spanish fleet anchored in the strait, carrying roughly 60 armored men toward the beach. Their commander is Ferdinand de Magellan, a Portuguese-born captain sailing under the Spanish crown, known to history as Ferdinand Magellan. He is near 50 years old, limping from an old wound taken years before in Morocco, and utterly certain of his plan. He means to punish a local chief named Lapu-Lapu, who has refused to submit to Spain and to the newly baptized rulers of neighboring Cebu. Magellan believes 40 or 50 steel-armored Europeans, backed by muskets and crossbows, can subdue an island simply by landing on it. He is wrong, and the record survives because a young Italian nobleman named Antonio Pigafetta is standing on that beach beside him. Pigafetta has sailed as a supernumerary on this voyage for nearly 2 years, keeping a private journal that will become the only detailed eyewitness account of what happens next. He writes that Lapu-Lapu's men number more than 1,500, arranged in 3 divisions along the shore, and that the tide will not let the Spanish boats come close enough to land their heaviest guns. What followed was not a battle in any sense Magellan had planned for. The ship's cannon, still afloat in deeper water, could not reach the beach where the fighting would happen. The armored men waded ashore through knee-deep water and soft sand, weighed down by breastplates never designed for a tropical shoreline, while stones, fire-hardened stakes, and iron-tipped spears came at them from every side. Pigafetta later recorded that the defenders seemed to recognize exactly where Spanish armor left a man exposed, aiming again and again for the legs below the metal. Magellan tried to hold his line and to keep his men from panicking into a retreat that would drown half of them in the shallows. He ordered part of the company to set fire to a cluster of nearby houses, hoping the flames would break the islanders' formation and buy time to withdraw in order. Instead, the burning huts seemed to enrage the defenders further, and the fighting pressed closer to the admiral himself, who had chosen, against the advice of his own officers, to stay at the rear and cover the retreat rather than fall back with the first boats. A bamboo spear went through his unarmored leg, and he went down into the surf. Pigafetta wrote that Magellan turned twice to look back at his men as they fled toward the boats, checking that they had made it safely before the mass of warriors closed over him completely. What followed, in the chronicler's account, was fast and merciless. A blow to the same wounded leg with a heavy sword, then spears and blades from several directions at once, until the man who had commanded the largest fleet ever sent from Spain toward the unknown Pacific lay dead in ankle-deep water, a few dozen yards from boats that could not reach him in time. 8 of his companions died with him. The rest reached the ships in a chaotic scramble, some of the boats so overloaded with fleeing men that oarsmen had to push wounded soldiers back into the water to keep from capsizing. Not one Spaniard managed to recover the body. Lapu-Lapu's men held the beach, and by the time the surviving officers regrouped aboard the fleet's 3 remaining ships, it was clear that no ransom, no threat, and no further landing party would bring Magellan's remains back to his own men. He would be buried, if buried at all, by people who had never asked to be conquered, and who had just proven, in a single morning, that they did not intend to be. For the sailors watching from the decks, the death of their commander was a disaster with no immediate remedy. Magellan had led them across an ocean no European fleet had ever crossed, through a strait at the southern tip of a continent that still bore his name only informally, and into island waters where none of the old charts meant anything. He was, for most of the men aboard, the only reason the voyage still had direction. Without him, command passed in confusion between officers who barely trusted one another, and the expedition's larger purpose, reaching the fabled Spice Islands and returning home with proof that Spain could reach Asia by sailing west, suddenly looked further away than ever. The map that sent Magellan toward Mactan had been drawn nearly 3 decades earlier, in a room he never entered, by men who had never seen the waters they were dividing. In 1494, at the Spanish town of Tordesillas, representatives of the Castilian and Portuguese crowns settled a dispute that Christopher Columbus's voyages had made urgent. Who owned the newly reached lands across the Atlantic, and who owned whatever lay beyond them? Pope Alexander VI had already sketched a rough boundary the year before. Tordesillas refined it into a line running north to south, roughly 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. Everything to the west of that line belonged to Castile. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. At the time, this seemed a manageable arrangement. Neither crown yet understood the true scale of the globe they were carving up, and both assumed the line would matter only in the Atlantic, where the competing claims actually collided. What the treaty's authors had not accounted for was the other side of the world, where a second, unmarked continuation of that same line would eventually cut through the Pacific and the East Indies, the region Europeans still called the Spice Islands. Nutmeg, cloves, and mace grown almost nowhere else on Earth had made the Moluccas, a small cluster of islands in what is now eastern Indonesia, one of the most valuable pieces of geography in the world. Portugal had already reached them by sailing east, around Africa and across the Indian Ocean, and had no intention of sharing the profits. Spain's problem was simple and expensive. The eastern route to Asia was closed to her by treaty and guarded by Portuguese ships and forts along the way. If Castile wanted a share of the spice trade, she needed another path, one that did not cross into territory Portugal could legally claim. The only option left on the map was to sail west, around or through the Americas, and hope to reach the Moluccas from the opposite direction, arriving at the same islands from the side the treaty had left open. Whether this was geographically possible, no one in Europe could say with certainty. No ship had done it. No one even agreed on how wide the Pacific truly was. This was the gap Ferdinand Magellan proposed to fill. He had served Portugal for years, sailing to India and to the Portuguese outposts in the east, and he had grown convinced, from charts, hearsay, and his own calculations, that a strait existed somewhere near the southern tip of the Americas, a passage that would let a fleet slip from the Atlantic into the Pacific without ever touching Portuguese waters. When his own king declined to fund the voyage, Magellan did something almost unthinkable for a man of his background. He crossed to Spain, renounced his Portuguese allegiance, and pitched the same idea to the young King Charles I, later better known to history as the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Charles's court had every incentive to say yes. A western route to the Moluccas would let Spain claim a legal share of the spice trade without firing a shot at Portugal, simply by arriving from the correct side of an invisible line drawn across an ocean no European had crossed. In March of 1518, the Crown granted Magellan a formal contract, 5 ships, royal financing, and the title of Captain General of what would be called the Armada de Molucca. His mission was never to conquer islands, plant colonies, or convert distant kings. It was, on paper, a trade expedition with a geographic point to prove, sent to open a route and bring back proof, in the form of cloves and nutmeg, that Spain could reach Asia legally. The voyage that followed tested every part of that plan almost immediately. 5 ships left Spain in September of 1519. The Trinidad, the San Antonio, the Concepcion, the Victoria, and the Santiago, crewed by roughly 260 men drawn from a half-dozen nations, a fact that would matter later since barely a fifth of them were native Spaniards. Distrust between the Spanish crown's appointed officers and the Portuguese-born commander simmered from the first weeks at sea. By the time the fleet reached the coast of Patagonia and settled in for a bitter winter at a harbor called San Julian, that distrust had become outright mutiny. 3 of Magellan's 5 captains attempted to seize control of the fleet in April of 1520. He crushed the rebellion with a combination of ruthlessness and improvisation that surprised even his own officers, executing 1 captain, marooning 2 Spanish clergymen, and a nobleman on the desolate coast, and pardoning the ordinary sailors whose labor he still needed to finish the voyage. It cost him a ship almost immediately afterward. The Santiago wrecked while scouting further south, though her crew survived and rejoined the fleet overland. Then, in October of 1520, after nearly a year at sea, Magellan found the passage he had promised, a narrow, freezing channel through the tip of South America that would eventually bear his name, though he himself never called it that. It took the remaining 4 ships 38 days to work through its currents and dead ends. One of them, the San Antonio, deserted during the passage and turned back for Spain entirely, taking with it a large share of the expedition's remaining provisions and leaving Magellan with only 3 ships to continue. The king, willing to talk, was not, in fact, ruling over some untouched or isolated backwater waiting to be discovered. He governed a small maritime polity that had been trading, warring, and marrying into networks stretching from southern China to the Malay Peninsula for centuries before a Spanish sail ever appeared on the horizon. Understanding what Magellan actually stumbled into requires setting the fleet aside for a moment and looking at the islands themselves, as they existed long before anyone in Europe had a name for them. There was no single Philippines in 1521, in the sense of one crown, one capital, or one people. The archipelago was a patchwork of many hundreds of small, independent polities, most commonly organized around a settlement unit the Spanish would later call the barangay, a word borrowed from the very boats, called balangay, that these communities used to migrate along the coasts and rivers in the first place. Each barangay typically held anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred families, governed by a chief known across much of the archipelago as a datu, whose authority rested on a mix of inherited status, personal wealth, skill in warfare, and the size of his network of debtors and dependents. Above the datu, in some of the larger and wealthier coastal centers, sat a raja, a title borrowed from Sanskrit and Hindu-Buddhist political vocabulary that had traveled through Southeast Asia centuries earlier, evidence of trade and cultural contact with India and the Malay world long before Islam or Christianity ever reached these shores. Religion in the archipelago was similarly varied, rather than singular. Most communities practiced forms of animism, honoring ancestral spirits called anito, mediated by ritual specialists, often women, known in different regions as babaylan or Catalonan, who conducted ceremonies for healing, harvest, and the passage of the dead. But by the time Magellan's ships arrived, this older spiritual landscape was already being reshaped by a newer force moving up from the south. Islam had reached the southern islands, particularly Sulu and Mindanao, over the preceding century, carried by traders and missionaries connected to the sultanates of Malacca and Brunei. Sulu had its own sultanate by the middle of the 1400s, and Muslim trading networks had begun pushing steadily northward, establishing footholds as far as Manila Bay itself by the time Spain arrived. Had Magellan's fleet come a century later, it is entirely possible the entire archipelago would have consolidated under Islamic rule before any European ship reached it at all. Cebu, where Magellan's 3 surviving ships now dropped anchor, sat outside that northward Islamic advance, though not outside its trading orbit entirely. It was ruled by a datu who held the title Raja, a man named Humabon, whose settlement controlled a natural harbor and a share of the trade passing between Chinese junks, Malay merchants, and neighboring island chiefs. Humabon was neither a subsistence chief unfamiliar with foreigners, nor a ruler desperate for Spanish protection. He was a shrewd political operator managing rivalries with neighboring datus, including one on the small island of Mactan just offshore, a chief named Lapu-Lapu who refused to recognize Humabon's authority and who would, within weeks, become considerably more famous than either of them. What Humabon saw arriving in his harbor was an opportunity as much as a curiosity. Magellan's fleet, battered and starving as it was, still represented formidable firepower, exotic goods, and a connection to a distant and evidently wealthy crown. A local trader, already resident in Cebu, a Malay-speaking Sumatran, according to Pigafetta's account, served as an interpreter, allowing negotiations to proceed with more clarity than the earlier landfalls at Homonhon and Limasawa had allowed, where communication had relied on gestures and the goodwill of a chief named Raja Kolambu, with whom Magellan had performed a blood compact, a ritual exchange of drops of blood mixed into shared cups of wine, sealing an alliance in a form the island's own political culture already recognized and valued long before any Spaniards set foot on the sand. Humabon, watching how quickly Kolambu had bound himself to the newcomers, calculated that a similar alliance with Magellan could tip the balance of power in his own favor, particularly against a scattering of rival datus who had never fully submitted to him, Lapu-Lapu chief among them. Within days of the fleet's arrival at Cebu in April of 1521, Humabon agreed to a blood compact of his own, and shortly afterward, encouraged by Magellan's chaplain and by Magellan himself, agreed to be baptized into the Catholic faith, taking the Christian name Carlos in honor of the Spanish king. His wife was baptized as well, taking the name Juana, and in the days that followed, several hundred of his subjects reportedly followed the same rite, whether from genuine conviction, political calculation, or simple deference to their ruler's example. No surviving record can say with certainty. Humabon's alliance with Spain did not survive Magellan by more than a few days. With their captain general dead on the sand at Mactan and no clear commander to replace him, the remaining officers turned to a Spanish clerk named João Serrao and a Spanish soldier named Duarte Barbosa to jointly lead what was left of the expedition, an arrangement that satisfied almost no one aboard the 3 surviving ships. Humabon, watching the newcomer's aura of invincibility collapse in a single lost battle, appears to have reconsidered the wisdom of his new alliance almost immediately, or else was pressed by his own nobles to do so. What followed has never been fully explained by any surviving account, though Pigafetta, still keeping his journal, recorded enough to reconstruct the outline. Barely a week after Magellan's death, Humabon invited the senior Spanish officers to a farewell banquet ashore, ostensibly to present gifts before the fleet's planned departure. Roughly 24 men attended, among them Barbosa and Serrao. Partway through the feast, Humabon's men fell on the guests with knives and clubs. Most of the officers were killed where they sat. Only a handful escaped back to the boats, wounded and half-dressed, shouting warnings to the ships still anchored offshore. The massacre gutted what remained of the expedition's leadership in a single afternoon. Pigafetta, who had stayed aboard ship that day rather than attend the banquet, survived by accident of scheduling rather than caution. With Barbosa and Serrao dead and no functioning command structure left, the surviving crew made a decision that would have been unthinkable under Magellan barely 2 weeks earlier. They burned one of their own 3 ships, the Concepcion, judging that they no longer had enough men to crew it, and sailed away from Cebu in the 2 vessels that remained, the Trinidad and the Victoria, without securing so much as a scrap of the trade goods the entire voyage had been funded to obtain. What followed for the next several months was less a mission than a retreat conducted at sea. The 2 ships wandered through the islands and further south toward the Moluccas, trading cautiously where they could, wary of any local ruler after what had happened at Cebu, and losing men steadily to disease, desertion, and the simple attrition of an expedition that had outlived its own purpose. By the time the ships finally reached the Moluccas late in 1521, nearly a year after Magellan's fleet had first sighted the Philippine Islands, they had a fraction of the crew and none of the commander they had set out with. There, at last, the surviving officers loaded the Trinidad and the Victoria with cloves, the spice the entire voyage had been commissioned to secure, only to discover that the Trinidad was no longer fit to sail. Her hull had rotted and split badly enough that repairs were impossible with the tools and timber available. The crew made the only choice left to them, the Victoria alone, under a Basque officer named Juan Sebastián Elcano, would attempt the voyage home, while the Trinidad's remaining men stayed behind to repair her as best they could and try a different, eastern route back across the Pacific toward Spanish territory in the Americas. The Trinidad's men fared badly. Portuguese forces in the region, already suspicious of any Spanish presence encroaching on waters they considered their own under the old treaty line, captured most of the survivors, and only a handful would ever see Spain again, years later, after long captivity. Elcano's choice, by contrast, was the gamble that made him famous. Rather than retrace the outward route across the Pacific and around South America, he sailed the Victoria west, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up the length of the Atlantic, the same route Portugal had always guarded jealously against Spanish ships. It meant sailing directly through waters Portugal considered its own by treaty, at constant risk of capture, with a crew reduced by scurvy and starvation to a skeleton fraction of the more than 260 men who had left Spain 3 years earlier. Only 18 of those original men were still aboard the Victoria when she limped into the harbor at Sanlúcar de Barrameda in September of 1522, laden with a cargo of cloves valuable enough, by some later accounts, to cover most of the expedition's original cost by itself. It was the first ship in recorded history to sail all the way around the globe, and Elcano, not Magellan, was the man standing on her deck when she arrived. The Spanish crown rewarded him with a coat of arms bearing a globe and the motto, Primus circumdediste me, the first to have gone around me, a distinction Magellan himself would never claim, since he had died in the shallows off Mactan, roughly a year before his own expedition finished what he had started. The pen that closed Spain's eastern ambitions belonged to a treaty signed at Zaragoza in April of 1529, and it settled a dispute that had been simmering ever since Elcano's battered crew proved a western route to the spice trade was possible at all. Both crowns now claimed the Moluccas by right of discovery and by conflicting readings of where, exactly, the old Tordesillas line reappeared on the far side of the globe. Rather than fight over a set of islands neither side could fully garrison from the other side of the world, Charles V agreed to sell Spain's claim to the Moluccas outright for a lump sum of 350,000 ducats, a debt Portugal would take years to fully settle. In exchange, a new demarcation line was drawn through the Pacific itself, placing the Moluccas and the rich clove trade firmly on the Portuguese side, and leaving Spain with a vague, undefined claim to whatever lay further north and east of that line, a stretch of ocean and islands that included, without anyone in Zaragoza much caring at the time, the archipelago where Magellan had died. Spain did not simply abandon the Pacific after Zaragoza, though the Crown's appetite for another expedition on the scale of Magellan's had clearly cooled. 4 more attempts followed over the next 3 decades, each smaller, cheaper, and less ambitious than the last, and each ending in some version of the same result: heavy losses, no lasting foothold, and crews that either turned back, wrecked, or simply vanished into Portuguese custody. In 1525, barely 3 years after the Victoria's return, a fleet under Garcia Jofre de Loaiza attempted to retrace Magellan's route through the strait at the tip of South America, hoping to establish a Spanish presence in the Moluccas despite the treaty negotiations still underway. Loaiza died at sea before ever reaching Asia, and much of his fleet was lost to storms, disease, and eventual capture by Portuguese forces already garrisoned in the islands he had hoped to claim. A second attempt followed in 1527, launched not from Spain, but from the recently conquered territory of New Spain, modern Mexico, under a captain named Álvaro de Saavedra Cerón. Saavedra's small fleet reached the Philippine Islands and continued on toward the Moluccas, where he found the survivors of Loaiza's expedition still stranded and skirmishing with Portuguese forces for control of the clove trade. Saavedra himself died attempting to sail back across the Pacific to New Spain, a return route that would defeat every Spanish navigator who tried it for the next 37 years, and his expedition, like Loisa's before it, dissolved into scattered survivors absorbed or captured by the Portuguese. A related attempt deserves mention chiefly for how little it accomplished. In the same period, the English-born navigator Sebastian Cabot, sailing for Spain, was dispatched with instructions that touched on the same Pacific ambitions, though his voyage drifted so far from its intended purpose, diverted by rumors of silver along the coast of South America, that it never came close to the islands at all. It stands less as a chapter in the Philippine story than as a measure of how difficult Spain found it, even 3 decades after Magellan, to keep an expedition focused on its original Pacific target. The most consequential of these failed voyages, for reasons that had nothing to do with conquest, sailed in 1542 under the command of Ruy López de Villalobos, dispatched once again from New Spain under orders from the viceroy. Villalobos's fleet reached the central Philippine Islands, the same waters where Magellan had died 2 decades earlier, and attempted to establish a settlement, first on the island of Mindanao and later on Leyte. Neither attempt held. Food ran short, relations with local datus soured, and a hoped-for return route across the Pacific proved just as impossible for Villalobos as it had for Saavedra before him. Within 2 years, his expedition had collapsed entirely, its survivors reduced to seeking refuge with Portuguese authorities in the Moluccas, the very rivals Spain had been trying to outmaneuver since Magellan's first landfall, and Villalobos himself died in Portuguese custody on the island of Amboyna in 1546, a prisoner of the very treaty line his own voyage had been sent to test. What Villalobos left behind, amid an expedition that failed by every practical measure, was a name. During his time among the Central Islands, he had named the group Leyte and Samar in an act of homage to the crown's young heir, Las Islas Filipinas, the Philippine Islands, in honor of Prince Philip, who would later rule as King Philip II. The name stuck, applied gradually to the wider archipelago, even though Villalobos himself never came close to conquering any of it, and even though the prince it honored would not order a serious attempt at conquest for another 18 years. The colonial administrator who finally broke this pattern was not chosen for any talent as a navigator or a soldier, and that, in the end, may have been exactly why he succeeded where 4 previous commanders had failed. Miguel López de Legazpi was a Basque-born official who had spent more than 2 decades in New Spain, rising through the colonial bureaucracy of Mexico City as a notary and treasury officer rather than a man of the sea. By the late 1550s, he held a comfortable post and a modest fortune, the kind of settled colonial career that rarely produces expeditions across an ocean. What changed his path was a decision made above him by a viceroy who had grown convinced that Spain's Pacific failures owed less to bad luck than to bad planning. That viceroy was Luis de Velasco, and King Philip II's instructions to him, issued in the 1550s, made the crown's priorities explicit in a way earlier expeditions had never quite managed. The Moluccas were gone, ceded to Portugal at Zaragoza, and any Spanish ship found trading there risked seizure under a treaty Spain herself had signed. But the islands further north, the Filipinas that Villalobos had named, and briefly, disastrously, tried to hold, remained legally ambiguous, close enough to the Portuguese sphere to be strategically valuable, far enough from the Moluccas proper that a settlement there might not violate the letter of Zaragoza at all. Philip's orders to Velasco were correspondingly narrow and specific. This expedition was not to trade in cloves, not to provoke Portugal, and not to repeat the pattern of landing, alienating the local population, and collapsing within 2 years. It was to establish a permanent foothold, and it was to find, at last, a way to sail back. Velasco assembled the expedition with a bureaucrat's caution rather than a conquistador's swagger, which is likely why he settled on Legazpi to lead it. Legazpi had no history of battlefield glory to defend and no personal fortune riding on a spectacular conquest. He had a reputation for patience, administrative competence, and the kind of steady temperament that might, Velasco calculated, avoid the impulsive violence that had doomed Magellan at Mactan and soured Villalobos's relations with the Datus of Leyte. Legazpi accepted the commission reluctantly, by some accounts, a man in his early 60s being asked to lead an expedition into the same waters that had already killed or captured every Spanish commander who had tried it before him. The second piece of Velasco's plan mattered even more than the choice of commander, and it involved a man who had spent years quietly working on the one problem that had defeated every previous voyage: the return route. Andrés de Urdaneta was an Augustinian friar by the time Legazpi's expedition was organized, but he had not always been a man of the cloth. As a young soldier and navigator, he had sailed with the Loaiza expedition back in 1525, one of the very few survivors of that catastrophic voyage, to eventually make his way back to Spain years later, after a long ordeal in the Moluccas and passage through Portuguese and other foreign ships. He had spent nearly a decade in Asian waters during that ordeal, observing currents, winds, and seasonal patterns that no chart in Europe recorded, before eventually returning home, entering religious life, and settling into what should have been a quiet retirement from the sea. Velasco and Philip's ministers sought him out specifically because of that decades-old experience, and persuaded him, against his own preference for a settled religious life, to join Legazpi's expedition as chief navigator and cosmographer. Urdaneta agreed on the condition that the voyage would prioritize peaceful settlement over conquest, a condition that aligned closely enough with the Crown's own instructions to Velasco that it caused no friction. He brought with him not just seamanship, but years of accumulated observation about the Pacific's currents, theories about a northern route home that no captain had yet dared to test, since it would mean sailing further from land into colder and less charted waters than any of the 4 failed expeditions before him had attempted. What Legazpi's fleet found, after nearly 3 months at sea, was not the same Cebu that had buried Magellan's officers 43 years earlier, though it took the expedition some time to understand exactly how the political landscape had shifted in the intervening decades. Raja Humabon was long dead, and the harbor he had once ruled now answered to his descendant, a chief named Raja Tupas, whose authority over Cebu was considerably less secure than his predecessors had been. Portuguese slave raids and traders had made periodic visits to the Central Islands in the decades since Magellan's death, and local memory of European ships was, understandably, wary rather than welcoming. Legazpi's fleet arrived off Cebu in April of 1565, and initial contact went badly enough to test every principle of patience Velasco had built into the expedition's instructions. Tupas's forces resisted the Spanish landing outright, and Legazpi, mindful of both his orders and his own temperament, chose not to force a confrontation on the scale Magellan had once attempted at Mactan. Instead, he ordered a controlled show of strength, cannon fire, aimed at abandoned settlements rather than at defended positions, calculated to demonstrate capability without provoking the kind of retaliatory massacre that had ended the previous Spanish presence in these same waters. It was a calibrated violence, still violence, but deliberately short of the impulsive aggression that had cost Magellan his life, and his officers their own. The turning point, when it came, arrived through an object rather than a battle. As Legazpi's men explored the ashes of a burned house near the shore, a soldier discovered a wooden image of the Christ child tucked inside a box that had somehow survived the fire largely undamaged. It was, by every reasonable account available to the Spanish at the time, the very image Magellan's own chaplain had presented to Raja Humabon's wife, Juana, as a baptismal gift more than 4 decades earlier, one of the few tangible relics remaining from an alliance that had ended in a bloodbath. For a crew already inclined to read Providence into their own survival at sea, the discovery landed as something close to a divine sign, proof that their return to this specific harbor had been ordained rather than merely strategic. Whatever its spiritual weight for the Spanish, the image also gave Legazpi a diplomatic opening that no amount of cannon fire could have produced on its own. Local memory of Humabon's Christian conversion and of the child image left behind after the massacre appears to have softened at least some of Tupas's resistance, or perhaps simply gave both sides a face-saving basis for renewed contact rather than continued war. Negotiations followed, conducted with the same ritual Magellan had once used to bind Raja Colombo and Humabon before him: a blood compact, drops of blood drawn and mixed with wine, sealing an alliance between Tupas and Legazpi that neither side, this time, intended to break within the week. Unlike Magellan, Legazpi did not treat this alliance as license to punish every neighboring Datu who declined to submit. His instructions from Velasco, and his own inclination, favored consolidation over conquest, a slow accumulation of loyal or at least neutral relationships across the Central Islands, rather than a single dramatic assertion of dominance. Within weeks of the Blood Compact, Legazpi formally founded a settlement on the site, naming it San Miguel, later renamed Villa del Santísimo Nombre de Jesus, in honor of the recovered Christ child image. And it stands, by the reckoning of Spanish colonial history, as the first permanent European settlement in the islands, the point at which 44 years of failure finally produced something that did not immediately collapse. The settlement's early years were modest and precarious rather than triumphant. Food remained scarce, since the expedition had planned for a controlled, gradual establishment of trade and tribute relationships rather than immediate self-sufficiency. And Legazpi spent much of 1565 and 1566 managing food shortages, occasional skirmishes with neighboring chiefs who had not shared in Tupas's alliance, and the constant uncertainty of whether reinforcement or resupply from New Spain would ever actually arrive. The settlement survived less through overwhelming force than through the same patient, calibrated diplomacy that had won over Tupas in the first place, a marked departure from the pattern of arrival, provocation, and collapse that had defined every Spanish attempt in these waters since Magellan. The ship sent to solve Urdaneta's half of the problem was the San Pedro, and command of her fell not to Legazpi, who remained at Cebu managing the fragile new settlement, but to his own grandson, a young officer named Felipe de Salcedo, sailing alongside Urdaneta himself. In June of 1565, barely 2 months after the Blood Compact with Raja Tupas had been sealed, the San Pedro left Cebu and turned north, away from the direct eastward line every previous return attempt had tried and failed to sail. Urdaneta's theory, built from years of observation during his long ordeal in Asian waters after the Loíza disaster 4 decades earlier, held that the winds and currents any ship encountered directly east of the Philippines were the same contrary forces that had already defeated Saavedra and, before him, doomed much of the Loíza expedition's remaining men to years of stranded exile. A ship trying to sail straight back the way it came was fighting the ocean's prevailing pattern rather than working with it. Urdaneta proposed instead that a vessel should sail north, well above the Philippines, into higher latitudes near Japan, where a different current, one modern navigators would eventually call the Kuroshio, ran eastward across the Pacific with a force strong enough to carry a ship most of the way to the American coast, almost as a passenger rather than a fighter against the sea. It was, on its face, a wager on decades-old memory over hard data, since no chart existed to confirm any of it, and no ship had ever deliberately tested the theory. The San Pedro sailed north past the coast of Japan into colder, rougher water than any previous Spanish attempt in these seas had risked, a route that traded the relative safety of known tropical waters for the possibility of an ocean current no European navigator could prove existed until a ship actually rode it home. For weeks, the crew endured plunging temperatures, a hull never built for the swells of the open northern Pacific, and the accumulating dread of men who had heard, secondhand, what had happened to Saavedra when he tried something similarly ambitious and never returned at all. The gamble paid off. By late September of 1565, after a crossing of roughly 4 months, the San Pedro sighted the coast of California, considerably further north than Acapulco, but unmistakably the American mainland, reached by a route no Spanish ship had ever successfully sailed before. Salcedo brought the ship down the coast to Acapulco itself in October, completing what would become known as the Tornaviaje, the return voyage, and in doing so, finally closed the loop that had defeated every Spanish captain since Magellan's own death at Mactan 44 years earlier. Urdaneta had done what 4 decades of failed expeditions and the deaths of Loaiza, Saavedra, and Villalobos had never managed. He had found the water road home. The importance of this single voyage is difficult to overstate against everything that came before it. A permanent settlement at Cebu meant little if every ship sent to reinforce or resupply, it was gambling its survival on an unproven return route, and every earlier colonial attempt in these islands had eventually failed for exactly that reason: cut off from home, unable to receive men, money, or instructions, left to wither under local pressure until nothing remained but abandoned buildings and a scattered handful of survivors absorbed into whatever community would take them in. Urdaneta's northern route changed that calculation entirely. A ship could now sail from New Spain to the Philippines on the prevailing trade winds heading west, and sail home again along the Kuroshio Current heading east, a round trip that, however difficult and dangerous in its own right, was at last reliable enough to be scheduled rather than merely hoped for. Legazpi received word of the San Pedro's successful crossing only months later, relayed back across the Pacific on a subsequent voyage, and the news transformed his own situation at Cebu from a precarious, isolated foothold into something with genuine prospects of permanence. For the first time since Magellan's expedition had first sighted these islands in 1521, a Spanish settlement in the Philippines had a functioning line of communication and resupply back to the rest of the empire, a connection that would, within a handful of years, evolve into one of the most consequential trade routes in the early modern world. Though neither Legazpi nor Urdaneta could have fully anticipated that outcome from a single ship's arrival at Acapulco in the autumn of 1565. The harbor Legazpi's men had heard described by traders throughout the Central Islands sat at the mouth of a wide river on the northern island of Luzon, and it was already, by the time Spanish ships approached it in the early 1570s, one of the busiest trading centers in the archipelago. Local chroniclers and later Spanish accounts describe a fortified settlement called Manilad, named for a mangrove-like plant, nilad, that grew thickly along its riverbanks, ruled jointly by a network of related Muslim datus, whose authority extended across the bay and into the surrounding countryside. Chief among them were 2 men whose names would recur throughout the accounts of the conquest that followed: Raja Suleiman, a younger ruler known for his combativeness, and Raja Matanda, an older kinsman whose title suggests seniority within the same ruling network, alongside a third figure, Lakandula, who held authority over a nearby settlement called Tondo, just across the river. This ruling structure was itself evidence of just how far the Islamic influence, spreading northward from Sulu and Mindanao over the preceding century, had already advanced by the time Spain arrived. Manilad's rulers maintained connections not only to Muslim Brunei, whose sultan held real influence over the settlement's politics, but to a wide trading network reaching Chinese merchants, Japanese traders, and communities throughout maritime Southeast Asia, making the port considerably more cosmopolitan and more strategically valuable than the smaller Central Island settlements Legazpi had already secured. Legazpi understood the value of this harbor immediately and dispatched an advance expedition under his grandson Juan de Salcedo, brother of the Felipe de Salcedo who had piloted the Tornaviaje, to assess the settlement before committing the bulk of his forces. Early contact in 1570 followed a familiar pattern of cautious negotiation, punctuated by suspicion on both sides. But talks broke down when Spanish forces, still under Salcedo's command, clashed with Suleiman's men in a skirmish that left part of the settlement burned and reinforced Raja Suleiman's determination to resist any further Spanish encroachment rather than negotiate the kind of blood compact Legazpi had secured at Cebu 5 years earlier. Legazpi arrived in person the following year, in 1571, commanding a larger force than Salcedo's initial expedition, and pursued the same combination of calibrated force and diplomatic overture that had worked at Cebu. Lacandula of Tondo, whose settlement had also suffered in the earlier fighting, proved more willing to negotiate than his younger kinsman Suleiman, and eventually accepted terms of alliance with the Spanish, a decision that split the ruling network at exactly the moment unified resistance might have made the most difference. Suleiman himself refused to submit, and led a final defense of Manila against Legazpi's combined force in May of 1571, a battle that ended in the settlement's capture and its ruler's death, according to most surviving accounts, though the precise circumstances of his death are recorded with less certainty than the outcome of the fighting itself. With Manila taken, Legazpi renamed the settlement Manila and moved the seat of Spanish authority there from Cebu almost immediately, recognizing that the harbor's trading connections, its river access to the agricultural interior of Luzon, and its position facing the South China Sea made it a vastly more valuable capital than the smaller port he had first secured. Unlike the prolonged, tentative consolidation that had characterized the early years at Cebu, Legazpi moved with unusual speed at Manila, formally establishing it as a Spanish city in June of 1571, complete with a municipal council, a governing charter, and the beginnings of what would become, within a matter of decades, one of the most important port cities anywhere in Spain's global empire. The speed of that transformation owed everything to the very trade networks the Spanish had just conquered rather than displaced. Chinese junks continued arriving at Manila's harbor within months of Legazpi's takeover, apparently indifferent to which local ruler now controlled the port, so long as trade continued on familiar terms, and Legazpi, whatever violence had accompanied his arrival, proved shrewd enough to encourage rather than disrupt this existing commerce. Lacandula's earlier decision to negotiate rather than resist paid off in ways that shaped the settlement's early administration, as his family retained local standing and influence within the new colonial order, a pattern of partial accommodation that would recur throughout Spain's slower, more negotiated conquest of the northern islands, in sharp contrast to the outright warfare that would continue, on and off, in the Muslim South for centuries to come. The man who inherited Legazpi's unfinished capital was Guido de Lavezaris, a royal treasury official who had sailed with the original 1564 expedition and now found himself, almost by default of seniority among the surviving officers, serving as acting governor of a colony barely 1 year into its existence at Manila. Lavezaris lacked his predecessor's patient diplomatic instincts, and his brief tenure was marked less by expansion than by the difficult, unglamorous work of turning a captured trading port into something resembling a functioning Spanish colonial administration, a task complicated by resources that remained thin and by a crown 8,000 miles away that communicated in instructions many months out of date by the time they arrived. The administrative system Lavezaris and his successors built rested heavily on a structure imported wholesale from Spain's older American colonies, the encomienda. Under this arrangement, the Crown granted individual Spanish colonists, called encomenderos, the right to collect tribute and labor from a specified population of local inhabitants in exchange for a nominal obligation to protect those inhabitants and provide for their instruction in the Catholic faith. In practice, across the Philippines, just as in Mexico and Peru before it, the system functioned chiefly as a mechanism for extracting rice, cloth, gold, and unpaid labor from communities that had little say in the arrangement, administered by encomenderos whose numbers in the islands remained relatively small, a few hundred grantees governing a population that, by the end of the 1570s, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The encomienda's reach depended entirely on cooperation from local datus, many of whom retained real authority within their own communities even as they were folded into this new Spanish framework of tribute and obligation. This was, in its way, a continuation of Legazpi's earlier strategy at Cebu and Manila, negotiated accommodation rather than wholesale destruction of the existing political order. And it meant that a great many of the Datu families who had ruled these communities before Spain's arrival, Lacandula's line among them, continued to hold local standing and function as intermediaries between their own people and the colonial administration, a role that would persist, in modified form, for generations. Around this administrative structure, the physical city of Manila itself began taking the shape that would define it for the next 3 centuries. Construction began on a walled district enclosing the seat of Spanish government, its churches, and its principal residences. A fortified enclosure the Spanish called intramuros, meaning simply within the walls, distinguishing it sharply from the far larger population of Chinese, Japanese, and indigenous residents who lived and traded in the districts just outside its gates. The walls themselves, built initially of wood and earthworks before later Spanish administrations replaced them with the stone fortifications that survive in fragments today, were as much a statement of separation as of defense, a physical boundary marking who belonged to the colonial governing class and who did not. The other institution, reshaping the islands during these same years, arrived not with soldiers but with friars, and its influence would ultimately prove far more durable than any encomienda grant or garrisoned wall. Spain's religious orders divided the archipelago among themselves with a thoroughness that colonial administrators rarely matched in their own governance. The Augustinians, who had accompanied Legazpi's original expedition and claimed the earliest missionary rights in the islands, took much of the central Visayas and parts of Luzon as their territory. Franciscan friars arrived shortly afterward and established their own zones of missionary responsibility, chiefly in the regions south and east of Manila. Dominican missionaries, arriving later in the 1580s, took charge of the northern provinces of Luzon, while the Jesuits, also arriving in that decade, assumed responsibility for portions of the Visayas, and, notably, for the more dangerous and less securely held missions in the south, where Muslim resistance remained active. This division was not merely bureaucratic housekeeping among competing religious orders. It created, in effect, a parallel structure of colonial governance that often exercised more direct daily authority over ordinary Filipinos than the encomenderos or royal officials did. A parish friar frequently served as the only Spanish authority a rural community would encounter with any regularity, responsible not just for religious instruction, but for tax collection, record-keeping, and adjudicating local disputes, a concentration of local power that would remain a defining feature of Spanish rule in the islands long after the encomienda system itself had been reformed or abolished. That something was silver, and the trade it financed would eventually dwarf every gold shipment the conquistadors of Mexico and Peru had ever sent home. Within a handful of years of Manila's founding, Spanish merchants and officials in the city recognized that the harbor's existing Chinese trade network, the same one that had continued operating almost without interruption through the change of local rulers, offered something New Spain's silver mines desperately wanted and Manila's Chinese trading partners were eager to supply: fine silk, porcelain, spices, and manufactured goods of a quality and abundance no Spanish colony in the Americas could produce on its own. The mechanism that formalized this exchange came to be known as the Manila Galleon trade, and its basic structure remained essentially unchanged for the better part of 2.5 centuries. Large, heavily built ships, typically 1 or 2 sailing each year rather than the frequent traffic of a normal trade route, departed Acapulco loaded with silver mined at Zacatecas and, increasingly, at the vast deposits of Potosi in the Andes. silver that had already made its way overland and by sea from South America to Mexico before ever being loaded aboard a galleon bound west. They crossed the Pacific along the familiar westward trade winds Legazpi's own fleet had used, arrived at Manila, and exchanged their silver for the accumulated goods Chinese junks had already carried down to the harbor from ports along the southern Chinese coast. Above all silk, but also porcelain, lacquerware, and spices gathered from across maritime Asia. The return voyage remained the far more difficult half of the circuit, and it depended entirely on the same Kuroshio current Urdaneta had discovered and Felipe de Salcedo had first sailed in 1565. Galleons loaded with Chinese goods sailed north before catching the eastward current back toward the American coast, a crossing that stayed brutally dangerous throughout the life of the trade, plagued by storms, disease, and the sheer duration of a voyage that could stretch to 6 months or more at sea. Losses were routine rather than exceptional. Entire galleons vanished on the return crossing across the centuries this trade operated, taking with them fortunes in silk and porcelain and, in some years, a meaningful fraction of the colony's entire annual revenue. What made this arrangement worth the risk was the scale of profit involved. Chinese silk purchased at Manila and sold in the markets of Mexico City, or carried further still to Spain itself, could return several times its original cost, a margin generous enough that merchants in New Spain continued financing the trade decade after decade, despite the very real chance any given galleon might never arrive. Silver, meanwhile, flowed the opposite direction in quantities that reshaped the Chinese economy itself. Ming China's growing preference for silver currency during exactly this period meant that American silver, carried first from Potosi to Acapulco and then across the Pacific to Manila, ended up circulating as far as the interior markets of China, making the Manila Galleon one of the first trade routes in history to link the economies of Europe, the Americas, and Asia into something resembling a single global system. Manila itself transformed accordingly. What had been, barely a decade earlier, a modest Muslim trading port captured after a single battle became, by the final decades of the 1500s, a genuinely cosmopolitan entrepot, its population swelling with Chinese merchants and laborers who settled in a designated district just outside the walls of Intramuros, known as the Parian. Alongside Japanese traders, Mexican and Peruvian colonists arriving to seek their fortune in the galleon trade, and the indigenous Filipino population whose labor in the shipyards, the docks, and the surrounding agricultural estates sustained the entire enterprise. Spanish colonial policy, wary of a Chinese population that soon outnumbered the Spanish residents of the city many times over, imposed restrictions on where Chinese merchants could live and trade, confining most to the Parian district, under conditions of periodic suspicion that would, within a few decades, erupt into violence on a scale the young colony had not yet experienced. For the Spanish crown, the value of this arrangement had almost nothing to do with the Philippines as a territory in its own right. Unlike Mexico or Peru, the islands produced no significant gold or silver of their own, and the agricultural tribute extracted through the encomienda system, while sufficient to sustain the colony's modest administration, never approached the wealth flowing through Manila's harbor as a transit point between American silver and Chinese goods. The Philippines mattered to Madrid chiefly as a way station, a fixed point where the empire's American silver and Asia's luxury goods could meet, exchange hands, and be loaded onto ships bound for opposite sides of the world. The colony's own governors understood this clearly enough that, for long stretches of the trade's history, official policy discouraged the development of local industries or agricultural exports that might compete with the far more lucrative business of simply taxing and regulating the annual galleons themselves. A single ship's cargo, properly taxed at Acapulco and again at Manila, could generate more revenue for the crown than years of tribute collected from every encomienda in the archipelago combined. Those vulnerabilities announced themselves barely 3 years after Legazpi's death, and the threat came not from a rival European power or a resentful local datu, but from a Chinese pirate fleet whose ambitions briefly matched anything Spain herself had attempted in these waters. Limahong, as Spanish chroniclers rendered his name, commanded a large seaborne force that had spent years raiding the southern Chinese coast before Ming naval pressure finally drove him and his followers to seek new territory elsewhere. Manila, still a young and lightly defended colonial capital, barely a decade old, offered exactly the kind of prize his fleet was searching for. Limahong's assault came in November of 1574, arriving with a force numbering, by contemporary Spanish estimates, several thousand men aboard dozens of vessels, an army considerably larger than the garrison Manila had on hand to defend it. The attack nearly succeeded on its first attempt. Spanish forces, caught with most of their strength scattered and their defenses still incomplete, suffered the loss of Martín de Goiti, one of the colony's most senior military officers, killed defending the city's initial line, before a determined counterattack, led in part by Juan de Salcedo, hurrying back from campaigns elsewhere in Luzon, managed to drive the invaders back from the walls in a fight that came closer to erasing the young colony than any single episode since Legazpi had first taken the harbor 3 years earlier. Repelled from Manila itself, Limahong withdrew north along the coast and established a fortified base near Pangasinan, apparently intending to found a settlement of his own, rather than abandon the region entirely. Spanish forces, alarmed at the prospect of a rival pirate colony taking root within their own claimed territory, pursued him there and laid siege to his position for months, eventually forcing Limahong to abandon the fort and disappear from the historical record entirely, his fleet scattering rather than suffering a single decisive defeat. Neither Spanish nor Chinese sources ever definitively recorded what became of him afterward, and his sudden appearance and disappearance stand as one of the closer calls the colony faced in its earliest years, a reminder that Spain's hold on Manila remained fragile enough that it could plausibly have fallen to someone other than the crown that had spent over 50 years and 4 failed expeditions trying to claim it. The uneasy relationship between the colonial administration and its resident Chinese population, already visible in the restrictions confining most merchants to the Parian district, deteriorated further and more violently as the size of that population grew alongside the galleon trade itself. By the final years of the 1590s, the number of Chinese residents in and around Manila, drawn by opportunities in trade, craftwork, and agriculture, had grown to several times the size of the entire Spanish population of the colony, a demographic imbalance that Spanish officials found increasingly difficult to reconcile with their own sense of secure control over the capital they governed. That imbalance erupted into open violence in 1603, when rumors and mounting suspicion between Spanish authorities and the Chinese community, inflamed in part by an ill-conceived Spanish expedition to a supposed mountain of gold that Chinese officials had reported and Spanish authorities had misread as a serious economic prospect, spiraled into a Sangley uprising, Sangley being the term Spanish colonists commonly applied to the resident Chinese population. Fighting broke out across the districts surrounding Manila, and Spanish forces, aided by Filipino auxiliaries who bore their own grievances against Chinese merchants competing in local trade, responded with a level of violence that left tens of thousands of Chinese residents dead by the time the uprising was suppressed, a death toll that dwarfed every earlier episode of conflict the young colony had experienced, Limahong's siege included. The aftermath of 1603 revealed the underlying contradiction at the heart of Spanish Manila more starkly than any single earlier crisis had. The colony depended entirely on Chinese merchants and laborers to sustain the very trade that made Manila valuable to the crown in the first place. Yet Spanish authorities remained perpetually suspicious of a community whose numbers so far outstripped their own that outright rebellion could, and periodically did, threaten the colony's survival. Similar, though smaller uprisings and reprisals would recur across the following decades. A recurring pattern of dependence, suspicion, and violence that never fully resolved itself for as long as the galleon trade continued to draw Chinese merchants to Manila's harbor in search of Mexican silver. While Manila's harbor absorbed the shocks of pirate fleets and Sangley uprisings, a quieter and ultimately more permanent transformation was unfolding across the lowland countryside, carried not by soldiers, but by the same religious orders that had divided the archipelago among themselves in the years following Legazpi's death. Augustinian, Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit friars, scattered across parishes from the Ilocos coast in the north to the Visayan Islands in the south, spent the closing decades of the 1500s and the opening decades of the 1600s engaged in a project of religious conversion whose scale would eventually reshape the archipelago's identity more thoroughly than any encomienda grant or colonial garrison ever managed. The methods friars used varied by order and by region, but certain patterns recurred widely enough to define the character of Philippine Catholicism as it took shape. Missionaries frequently built their earliest churches on or near sites already recognized as sacred within local animist practice, a strategy that eased the transition for communities accustomed to particular groves, springs, or burial grounds carrying spiritual significance. Friars learned local languages with a thoroughness that surprised even their own superiors in Spain, producing dictionaries and catechisms in Tagalog, Cebuano, Ilocano, and a dozen other tongues within the first few generations of missionary work, a linguistic investment that made the friars, rather than any secular colonial official, the most consistent point of contact between the Spanish administration and the great majority of ordinary Filipinos who never learned Spanish at all. Conversion, where it succeeded, rarely meant a clean replacement of one belief system with another. The Babaylan and Catalonan, the ritual specialists who had mediated communities' relationships with ancestral spirits before Spain's arrival, did not simply disappear once baptism became widespread. Their functions and their authority persisted in modified form, sometimes folded into new roles within lay Catholic devotional practice, sometimes surviving alongside official church structures as a parallel, semi-tolerated tradition of folk healing and ritual. Catholic saints absorbed some of the protective and intercessory roles once assigned to ancestral spirits and local deities, and devotional practices that Spanish friars considered Orthodox Catholic piety often carried, beneath the surface, older patterns of belief about spirits, omens, and the ritual power of particular places and objects. The recovered Santo Niño image at Cebu itself, a telling example of how quickly a Catholic relic could take on a significance closer to that of a protective talisman in local devotion. By the middle decades of the 1600s, this combination of linguistic accommodation, syncretic devotional practice, and the friars' near-total dominance of local religious and administrative life had produced something unprecedented anywhere else in maritime Southeast Asia. A lowland population, overwhelmingly professing the Catholic faith, organized into parishes that doubled as units of colonial tribute collection and labor organization, governed day to day far more by a parish priest than by any distant royal official in Manila. Estimates from later in the colonial period suggest that the great majority of the archipelago's lowland population, likely exceeding 9 in every 10 residents across Luzon and the central Visayas, had been baptized into the church within a few generations of the missionary order's arrival, a rate of conversion that outpaced anything Spain achieved in most of its American territories over a comparable span of time. That success, however, stopped decisively at the same frontier that had already resisted every Spanish military expedition sent against it. In Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago, Islam's earlier and deeper roots, reinforced by sustained political and military resistance from the sultanates, meant that Catholic missionary efforts achieved only scattered and often temporary footholds, chiefly in coastal garrison towns that Spain managed to hold by force rather than through the kind of gradual accommodation that had worked so effectively in the north. Jesuit missionaries assigned to these southern territories operated under conditions closer to those of a contested military frontier than a settled parish, their converts few, their tenure often brief, and their work punctuated by the same cycles of raid and reprisal that characterized Spain's broader failure to subdue the southern sultanates by force of arms. It was, rather, the accumulated outcome of 100 separate parish assignments, military campaigns, and local accommodations, each decided on its own terms over the better part of a century, and by the time Spanish administrators in Manila had any clear overview of the pattern it had produced, the line between a converted north and a resistant south was already too entrenched to redraw. What that settled religious map made possible, in turn, was a period of relative stability across the lowland provinces that allowed the galleon trade itself to reach its fullest and most lucrative expression, a stretch of roughly 2 centuries, from the early 1600s through the middle decades of the 1700s, during which Manila functioned as one of the genuine hinges of early modern global commerce. The scale the trade reached during these peak decades is difficult to convey through any single figure, since so much of the silver moving through Manila's harbor passed through informal channels, smuggling, and underreported cargoes that Spanish officials themselves struggled to track accurately, but contemporary estimates suggest that a substantial share of all the silver mined in the Americas during this period, quite possibly as much as a third by some historians' calculations, eventually made its way across the Pacific through Manila and into Chinese hands, a transfer of wealth on a scale that reshaped Ming and later Qing dynasty monetary policy from the other side of the world. Chinese demand for silver as currency remained so consistent across these centuries that Manila's merchants could count on a ready market for Mexican pesos regardless of fluctuations in any other part of the trade, a reliability that made the galleon circuit one of the steadiest, if still perilous, commercial arrangements anywhere in the Spanish Empire. This traffic in silver and silk carried other cargo as well, less valuable by weight, but arguably more consequential over the long run, living plants, seeds, and agricultural techniques that crossed the Pacific in both directions and permanently altered diets on opposite sides of the world. Maize, tobacco, sweet potato, and chili peppers, all originally domesticated in the Americas, arrived in the Philippines aboard galleons and Chinese trading vessels alike, spreading from there into the wider agricultural systems of maritime and mainland Asia within a matter of generations. Tomatoes, likewise American in origin, followed a similar path into Filipino and eventually broader Asian cuisine. In the opposite direction, mangoes, tamarind, and a range of Asian fruits and spices made their way to Mexico aboard the same galleons, embedding themselves so thoroughly in Mexican agriculture and cooking that their Asian origins would be all but forgotten within a few centuries, folded into what later generations simply considered Mexican cuisine. The people who crewed, financed, and lived off this trade proved just as mobile as its cargo. A meaningful population of Filipino sailors, recruited or pressed into service aboard the galleons themselves, made the crossing to Acapulco repeatedly across these centuries, and a number settled permanently in Mexico, particularly along the Pacific coast, where small communities of Filipino descent persisted for generations, intermarrying with local populations and leaving behind traces in coastal cuisine and craft traditions that historians would only later trace back to their galleon-era origins. Manila's own population, meanwhile, continued absorbing new arrivals from every direction the trade touched. Chinese merchants and artisans who settled permanently despite the periodic violence of uprisings like that of 1603, Japanese traders and Christian refugees fleeing periods of persecution in their own country, and a growing population of mestizos, born of unions between Chinese settlers and Filipino women, who would eventually form one of the colonial Philippines' most economically significant and distinct social classes. This mestizo community, generally referred to in later colonial records as Chinese mestizos, occupied an unusual position within the rigid racial hierarchy Spanish administrators tried, with only partial success, to impose on their colony. Barred by policy and prejudice from many of the privileges reserved for peninsular Spaniards, or even for Spaniards born in the colonies, Chinese mestizos nonetheless built substantial fortunes through trade, moneylending, and landholding across the 17th and 18th centuries, accumulating an economic influence that would, generations later, place their descendants among the wealthiest and most politically significant families in the islands, long after the galleon trade itself had ended and Spain's rule had given way to other powers entirely. The first serious blow to the old arrangement arrived not from a storm or a lost galleon, but from a rival European power that had, until this point, played almost no direct role in the story of Spanish Manila. In September of 1762, during the wider global conflict later known as the 7 Years' War, a British naval expedition sailing from India appeared off Manila Bay, and the city that had survived Limahong's pirate fleet, the Sangley uprising, and 2 centuries of typhoons, found itself facing an enemy considerably better armed than anything it had prepared for. The garrison, undermanned and equipped with defenses that had changed little since the previous century, held out barely 2 weeks before British forces breached the walls of Intramuros and occupied the city outright. An occupation that would last nearly 2 years before the war's end returned the Philippines to Spanish control under the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. The British occupation exposed a vulnerability that no amount of Manila's accumulated wealth had ever addressed. The colony's defenses had been built and maintained on the assumption that no serious European rival would ever seriously contest Spain's hold on so distant and, in strictly military terms, so lightly garrisoned a possession. That assumption no longer held in a century increasingly defined by contested global trade routes and expanding British and Dutch commercial power throughout Asia. Although Spain recovered Manila once the war ended, the episode prompted a wave of administrative anxiety in Madrid about whether the old galleon system, dependent as it was on a single annual voyage and a lightly defended capital, remained a sound basis for holding the islands at all. That anxiety coincided with a broader shift in Spanish colonial thinking that historians would later group under the label of the Bourbon Reforms, a set of policies pursued across the second half of the 1700s by Spain's reigning Bourbon monarchs aimed at modernizing and diversifying an empire that had, in the view of reform-minded ministers in Madrid, grown too dependent on a handful of narrow, monopolistic trade arrangements. The Manila Galleon, for all its profitability, represented exactly the kind of restrictive single-route commerce these reformers hoped to move beyond. Royal decrees during this period gradually loosened the galleon monopoly, permitting a wider range of ships and merchants to trade directly between the Philippines and Spain via routes around Africa and India rather than exclusively through the Acapulco crossing, and encouraging colonial administrators to develop the island's own agricultural exports rather than relying so heavily on the transit trade in Chinese goods. This shift produced, over the following decades, a slow but unmistakable reorientation of the Philippine colonial economy. Cash crops that had played only a minor role in the island's earlier trade, tobacco chief among them, expanded dramatically under new royal monopoly arrangements established in the 1780s, turning provinces across Luzon into centers of large-scale cultivation aimed at export rather than local subsistence. Sugar cultivation expanded similarly in the Visayas, laying the groundwork for plantation economies that would come to define significant portions of the archipelago's agricultural landscape long after the galleon trade itself had ceased to matter. A newly chartered Royal Philippine Company, established in 1785, attempted to formalize this shift toward direct trade with Spain and diversified colonial exports, though its own commercial success proved uneven at best across the decades it operated. The galleon trade did not vanish overnight under this pressure, but its decline over the following decades was steady and, in retrospect, difficult to reverse. Fewer ships made the crossing each year. Cargoes grew smaller relative to the trade's earlier peak, and the silver for silk exchange that had once defined Manila's entire commercial identity gradually gave ground to the newer export economy the Bourbon reforms had encouraged. The final blow came not from any single Philippine or Spanish policy decision, but from a hemisphere away, in the collapsing political order of Spain's American colonies. Mexico's own War of Independence, breaking out in 1810 and grinding on for more than a decade, severed the very route the entire trade had depended on since Urdaneta first proved it possible in 1565. With Acapulco itself caught up in revolutionary upheaval and the New Spain that had financed and received the galleons for 2.5 centuries ceasing, within a few years, to exist as a Spanish colony at all, the trade that had connected Manila to the Americas had nowhere left to sail. With the galleon trade gone and no realistic prospect of reviving it, Spanish colonial administrators in Manila found themselves managing an economy that had to justify itself on entirely new terms for the first time in 2.5 centuries. The response, formalized in 1834 when the Crown officially opened Manila to direct trade with foreign merchants rather than restricting commerce to Spanish vessels alone, marked as sharp a break from the old order as the founding of the galleon route itself had once been. British, American, and other foreign trading houses established themselves in the city within a few years of the port's opening, and the archipelago's economy pivoted decisively toward the export crops the Bourbon reforms had already begun encouraging decades earlier. Sugar from the Visayas, abaca fiber prized abroad for rope and cordage, tobacco still grown under royal monopoly in Luzon, and increasingly coffee grown in the highland provinces. This new export economy enriched a class of landholders and merchants in ways the old silver and silk transit trade never had, since profit now depended on production within the islands themselves rather than simply taxing goods passing through Manila's harbor on their way somewhere else. Chinese mestizo families, already established through generations of trade and landholding built up during the galleon era, proved especially well positioned to capitalize on this shift, acquiring large agricultural estates and expanding into export commerce with a speed that made many of them, by the middle decades of the 1800s, among the wealthiest families in the colony, rivaling and in some cases surpassing the fortunes of peninsular Spanish officials sent out from Madrid to govern them. Wealth on this scale bought something the old colonial order had never extended to families of mixed or indigenous descent in any meaningful numbers: education abroad. The sons of these prosperous mestizo and, increasingly, indigenous Filipino landholding families began traveling to Europe in growing numbers from the middle of the 1800s onward, studying law, medicine, and the sciences at universities in Spain and elsewhere on the continent, and returning home, or in some cases remaining abroad, with an education that exposed them directly to the liberal, nationalist, and reformist political currents reshaping 19th century Europe. This educated class, which contemporaries and later historians alike came to call the Ilustrados, the enlightened ones, would furnish the writers, lawyers, and reformers who, within a few decades, began articulating the first coherent arguments for Filipino self-governance, and eventually for outright independence from the very crown Legazpi had once claimed these islands for. Their emergence marked a genuinely new chapter in the island's history, one this documentary has not set out to tell in full, since the arc from Ilustrado reform movements through revolution against Spain and into a new colonial relationship with the United States belongs to a different and later story than the one that began with Magellan's death on a beach at Mactan. What matters, for the purposes of understanding how Spain's conquest of the Philippines finally exhausted itself, is that the very economic and educational transformations set in motion by the galleon trade's collapse, the export economy, the mestizo fortunes, the ilustrados European educations, produced within a few generations a Filipino political class capable of imagining and eventually fighting for an archipelago no longer ruled from Madrid at all. Spain's rule in the islands would end formally in 1898, 377 years after Magellan first sighted these shores and died attempting to claim them. A span of Spanish presence considerably longer than the history of the United States that would, in the same year, take over as the island's next colonial power. Walk through Intramuros today, and you can still trace the outline of the walls Legazpi's successors began raising over 4 centuries ago. Thick stone bastions restored and rebuilt across generations of earthquake damage, wartime destruction, and careful modern reconstruction, enclosing a district that no longer functions as the seat of any government, but still draws visitors tracing the footprint of the city where a captured Muslim trading port became the hinge of a global trade route. San Agustin Church, standing within those walls, ranks among the oldest stone structures in the entire archipelago, its foundations laid in the final years of the 1500s by the same Augustinian order that had accompanied Legazpi's original expedition to Cebu, and it survives today as one of a small cluster of Philippine churches recognized by UNESCO for the distinct architectural tradition Spanish friars and Filipino builders developed together across these islands. In Cebu, the Basilica del Santo Niño still houses the small wooden image of the Christ child that Legazpi's soldier found in 1565 amid the ashes of a burned house, the same image believed to be the gift Magellan's own chaplain had presented to Raja Humaban's wife 44 years earlier. It remains, to this day, one of the most venerated Catholic relics anywhere in the Philippines, an object that has survived fire, colonial upheaval, and the collapse of the empire that first brought it ashore, carried now through the streets of Cebu each January in a festival called Sinulog that draws millions of participants, most of whom trace the occasion's origins only loosely, if at all, back to a single burned house and a single desperate discovery nearly 460 years ago. Not far from the basilica stands a weathered cross, encased in wood and tortoiseshell for protection, said to mark the site where Magellan's own expedition first raised a wooden marker after Humaban's baptism, an object of local reverence that blends historical memory with devotional practice in a way neither Magellan nor Legazpi could have anticipated. The religious map both men helped set in motion remains, in its broad outline, exactly what those first generations of friars left behind. The Philippines endures today as the only nation in Asia with a majority Catholic population, a demographic fact traceable directly to the parish-by-parish conversion campaigns of the 15 and 1600s, while Mindanao and Sulu remain home to the country's Muslim minority, descendants of the same sultanates whose resistance Spanish arms never fully overcame across 3.5 centuries of intermittent war. Language, too, still carries the imprint of this history in ways easy to overlook. Filipino languages retain thousands of Spanish loanwords, woven so thoroughly into everyday speech, for numbers, for household objects, for units of time, that most speakers use them without any sense of foreign origin at all. A linguistic residue of a colonial relationship that ended politically in 1898, but never fully receded from the way people actually talk. Trace the old galleon route itself, and its afterlife proves just as durable, if less visible. The maize, chili, tomato, and sweet potato that first arrived aboard Spanish and Chinese trading vessels 4 centuries ago are now so embedded in Filipino cooking and in the wider cuisines of maritime Asia that absorb them along the same trade networks, that identifying their American origin surprises most people encountering the fact for the first time. In Mexico, the reverse holds true. Mango, tamarind, and a handful of Asian culinary techniques that crossed the Pacific in Chinese and Filipino hands centuries ago have folded so completely into Mexican food culture that their foreign origin has been almost entirely forgotten. a quiet, edible monument to a trade route that stopped running 2 centuries ago, but never stopped feeding people on both sides of an ocean it once crossed at such staggering human cost. None of this was the outcome Ferdinand Magellan set out to secure when he proposed a western route to the Moluccas to a young Spanish king in 1518, and none of it existed in any form when he died in the shallows off Mactan 3 years later, betrayed by his own overconfidence and buried, if buried at all, somewhere his own men were never able to recover. He had been chasing cloves, sailing toward islands his own maps barely acknowledged, on behalf of a crown far more interested in a treaty line than in the archipelago itself. What grew from that failure? Across 44 years of wrecked expeditions and one patient administrator's calibrated diplomacy, one friar's decades-old memory of ocean currents, and nearly 3 centuries of silver and silk crossing an ocean that had killed or captured every man who first tried to master it, was never planned by any single hand in Madrid. It accumulated, treaty by treaty, blood compact by blood compact, galleon by galleon, until an accident of failed geography had become one of the longest-lasting colonial relationships in world history. 499 years after Antonio Pigafetta watched his captain die in the shallows off Mactan, the government of the Philippines announced how it intended to mark the anniversary, and the announcement itself revealed just how unsettled this history still remains in the country it produced. 2021, the true 500th year since Magellan's fleet first reached these waters, and since Lapu-Lapu's warriors turned him back at the water's edge, arrived amid a national commemoration that could not quite decide whether it was celebrating an arrival or a resistance, and in the end chose to do both, awkwardly, in the same calendar year. Spain's own contribution to the anniversary leaned toward the older framing, marking the voyage as the completion of the first circumnavigation of the globe, an achievement of navigation and endurance in which the Philippines had featured chiefly as a waypoint and, eventually, a tragedy for its commander. Exhibitions in Spanish museums and coordinated events with Portugal, still working out after 5 centuries exactly how much credit Magellan's Portuguese origins deserved against Elcano's completion of the voyage under a Spanish flag, treated the story largely as Pigafetta himself might have wanted it told. A tale of a captain who died attempting something no one had done before, and of an 18-man crew who finished it without him. The Philippine government's own commemoration told a different story, and told it deliberately. Rather than center the anniversary on Magellan, official events across the country elevated Lapu-Lapu, the Mactan chief who had refused Magellan's demand for submission, to the explicit status of the nation's first resistance hero, a figure whose actual biography survives only through a handful of lines in Pigafetta's own chronicle, but whose symbolic weight had grown, over 5 centuries, into something considerably larger than the sparse documentary record could support on its own. Statues of Lapu-Lapu, already standing in Manila and on Mactan itself before the anniversary, anchored ceremonies attended by government officials who described the battle not as an obstacle Spain eventually overcame, but as the opening act of a resistance that, as the later chapters of this account have traced, never fully ended in the south and never fully succeeded in erasing local identity in the north. The tension in that framing is worth sitting with, because it is, in its way, the same tension that has run through this entire account since the moment a young Italian chronicler first watched his captain wade into the surf at Mactan, believing 50 armored men could subdue an island. Lapu-Lapu won that morning, and the win meant nothing to the empire that arrived 44 years later under Legazpi, patient and methodical in exactly the ways Magellan had not been, and built, on the ashes of that first failure, something that would last 377 years. The Philippines, that commemorated its own quincentennial in 2021, is a nation whose language, faith, and food carry Spain's imprint as deeply as any former colonies ever has. And that same nation chose, when it finally had the chance to tell its own version of the story, to lead with the man who beat the empire back rather than the one who eventually built it. Both things are true at once, and neither cancels the other out. Magellan's death at Mactan was a genuine defeat, and it changed nothing about what came after, because empires, it turns out, do not need their first attempt to succeed. They need only a viceroy willing to try again with a different kind of man, a friar willing to remember a current no one else had bothered to chart, and 3.5 centuries in which to let a walled city, a rescued idol, and a trade route nobody originally planned settle so deeply into a place that its people would still be arguing, 500 years later, over how much of that history to mourn and how much to keep. Stand on the beach at Mactan today, where the monument to both men now stands within sight of each other, and you are standing in the one place on earth where that argument still plays out in stone. It is worth the visit if you ever find yourself in that part of the world, if only to decide for yourself which of the two men buried nothing that morning and which one built an empire by accident instead.